Greetings, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the City of Providence Housing Price Task Force. Today is Thursday, June the 29th, 2023. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairwoman Harris,
Present.
Vice Chairman Espino,
Present.
Councilwoman Gray is absent, Councilwoman Peterson,
Here.
Councilor Roya,
Present.
Board President Rob absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you so very much. This is the presentation that we all been so excited about tonight. So Madam Clerk, could you please read the first item into the roll?
Item one, presentation of ambitions in Providence by the Rhode Island Center of Justice, Executive Director Jennifer Woods.
I would like very much for Ms. Jennifer Woods to join us at the table, and anybody else you want to bring with you, please come along.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, with me, two of my colleagues this evening.
And I would like for each of you, one by one, to introduce yourself for the record, please.
Good evening. My name is Jennifer Wood, and I'm the director at the Rhode Island Center for Justice. The Rhode Island Center for Justice is a small nonprofit law firm that represents individuals who do not otherwise afford a lawyer. And one of our largest areas of focus is on eviction defense and conditions cases and housing. And the majority of our cases actually are Providence residents. So we're very honored to be here to talk with you this evening about the housing crisis. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Kramer. I'm a supervising housing attorney at the Center for Justice. Thank you so much for having us here today.
Good afternoon. My name is John Carwashin. I'm also a supervising attorney at the Center for Justice. Thank you all for having us here today.
Thank you so much. Before we get started, I would like to entertain a motion to enter this document of their presentation, evictions on the rise, into our record, please.
So moved.
I have a motion. And motion have been made in second. All in favor? Aye. All right. We'll want to hear from you. We're gonna listen to your presentation. And then we're gonna allow the the committee to have whatever questions that you have. And if there's any public that would like to speak, we'll do that as well. Okay, so we want to listen to hear what's going on in the world.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And we are prepared to make a presentation, but I also really want to invite and encourage questions as we move through the
Oh,
material.
okay, that's right. We can do it. All right, that's all right. Yeah.
Because we work with so many Providence residents in the context of the district court and eviction, and we have some statistical material to present to you. We were asked some questions about what are we seeing in terms of trends? How many evictions? How does that compare to recent past, et cetera? But as we present this material, we would really, really value the opportunity to answer your questions about the actual lived experience on the ground for those who are facing eviction support.
We will follow your lead and we will definitely ask questions.
Thanks.
Is the committee all right with that? All right. Okay.
So Sam, you're up.
Great. I'll start us off. We look at page one here, total evictions in Providence over the last year. Now I put together this presentation in May or June, which is why the numbers go from May 22 to April 23. And it's noted at the bottom, just so you know, these numbers all come from the Princeton Eviction Lab, which tracks violence across the country in most states, Rhode Island being one of them. And if you have any, interest in looking at those numbers, the URL is actually included at the bottom of the presentation. One of the things that you'll see first, right, is there are 13,792 filings since March 15, 2020. That's an important date, right? That's the beginning of kind of the recognition of the pandemic and a lot of public policy. And you'll see that 70% of the average filing. So that represents a marked decline, right, over the course of the pandemic. However, the next number, the actual evictions that have occurred this last year, from May 22 to April 2023, it's 5,983. And you'll see that's actually 95% of the average. So in very large terms, or in the big picture, what it's saying is that, filings dipped during the pandemic. And then in the last year, what we've seen is a rise in filings such that we're right back where we were beforehand. As things like the CDC moratorium have ended, things like Rent Relief Rhode Island have ended. And actually on the topic of Rent Relief Rhode Island, there's an interesting trend that you can notice in this chart. So you'll see that in June of 22, that's the second column there. The evictions are still below average. So the column on the right is the actual evictions. On the left, the darker column, that's the average over time, right? And things remain below average in June and July. It's important to note that Rent Relief stopped accepting applications on June 1st, 2022. So mark that down as the date when relief applications stopped coming in. And what you see then is a steady uptick in filings against average as fewer and fewer people were receiving assistance. The Rent Relief Rhode Island program wasn't paying some tenants between the months of June and November. But you can see that very quickly, August of 2022, filings jump right back up to average and remain at or above typical filing numbers for the most part from August until April. So, my big takeaway from that is that the program had a big impact on reducing filings. So making rental assistance available really did decrease the number of filings. Yes, Chairman.
May I? Is that because the price of rent is on the rise, or what is it? I mean, rent relief sort of gave people, funding towards, the rents, right? Or is it behind rent that really happened? How was the funding of that? Was it because people were behind, or was it, because people just needed to rent and they applied for it? Which one was it?
So in order to be eligible for the program, these were individuals who had a arrearage. And particularly because it was an emergency rental assistance during the era of the pandemic, people may have lost employment, lost one member of the household would have a reduction in employment, and so people fell behind. So it was originally designed to address that, but I think that the point that my colleague was making is that there is a chronic gap between earnings and rent. And we know that. And
That's exactly what was my next question.
So this was an exacerbation when a lot of people slipped further behind.
Right.
But this is not a forward-facing rental subsidy program. That's a whole different thing that we should talk about tonight. This was really initially an emergency program to address people that had fallen behind in their rent due to or during the pandemic. But what it reveals to us is that that had a major protective effect to reduce the number of evictions. Because there's even pre-pandemic, of course, it's been well documented in Housing Works and other sources that there is a serious gap between average earnings and average rent. And that is the whole discussion that many of you, I'm sure, have heard in this committee and in others about people who are rent burdened or severely rent burdened. Obviously, they're paying way more as a proportion of their income than they can afford to on a monthly basis.
And you are correct that rents have inflated over the last year. Rents have been inflating higher than the rate of inflation for other consumer goods for years now. That's not a trend that we see slowing down this last year either. So the rents keep going up and going up faster than other things that people are spending money on.
Why do you,
Councilman Lewis.
I'm so sorry.
Let me jump in, sorry.
I have my theories as to why it keeps rising and rising, but I'd like to hear why you both think that rents keep rising in the city. Or nationwide rather. I mean. But the city also.
It's an incredibly complicated question, right? I don't know that I have a clear answer for, but there are a lot of factors in play, right? there's been a consolidation of ownership of rental properties, right? And anytime you see a consolidation of ownership, you see greater control over, large segments of the market, right, which then allows for prices to go up. There's a really marked lack of supply of housing around right now. Both affordable units and otherwise, the vacancy rates, I've looked at the vacancy rates in the state of Rhode Island, I've seen numbers quoted anywhere from 2% to 4 or 5%. The Economic Progress Institute, I don't have this number like right at the tip of my brain, so you might want to check this number, but when I was doing the research, I think they said that any vacancy rate below 6% is going to create upward pressure on prices. That's I think a lot of it, but there are a lot of other factors you can consider.
Yeah, I think one of the other major ones is just the unaffordability of most housing in Rhode Island. In order to purchase, right? I think prices on the east side are super high, prices on the west side are super high, prices in Elmhurst are rising, and prices in West are super rising. The south side is really one of the only areas of housing right now where you can find affordable housing, and a lot of those are being purchased, renovated, and rented out at higher values. So I think that's another reason why.
I would point to the increase in property values that John was mentioning, because I think we've all seen that trend nationally and locally, that during the pandemic, there was kind of a bizarre real estate. And so that made it much more attractive to purchasers to have, purchasing these properties, but then when you pay that kind of heightened amount for the purchase of the property, then you have to turn around and pass that along, and there are incentives to do so. So this is not a scientific study. If we need that, go to the Housing Works data, but anecdotally, when we look at our clients' experience, before the pandemic, we would often interview clients who were coming in and saying, okay, I've been paying $850 a month for my apartment. That may or may not include utilities, $950 a month. And these were for low-income individuals who were coming to us for help. So that meant that was kind of the lower prices that we were seeing in the rental market in Providence. And in the intervening 3 years, I can't remember the last time someone came in the office and said my monthly rent is $850 or $950 a month. Now it's $1,500, $1,600, $1,700, and these are families that couldn't afford $500. So it's stark and dramatic, and we're also seeing a lot of patterns of people doubling up because of those price differences. Because our clients were struggling at $950. So if you're at $1,550 or $1,600, it's literally unaffordable. So those are the pressures that we've seen over the last years.
And that creates some other questions that are actually mentioned later in the presentation. I think we can speak to in terms of what like the effect it has on people when they're living in a place that there's historically been affordable or is cheap because it might be less than or that there might be well let's call it substandard housing, right? There's a market for substandard housing, and a lot of people who are very limited in their means are up in that market for any of those reasons. But then if their options then are to either put up with that and move, and moving means almost doubling the rents, a lot of people feel very stuck in that position, right? We can talk a little bit more about that later. I do want to bring up the elephant. We're talking about why rents are going up and all this. And one of the big reasons is because there's nothing to control it, right? We're talking about market forces here, right? We're talking about free market economics and how that plays into people's ability to purchase, if you will, housing. And there isn't an external control on that right now. So that's, I think, kind of the unspoken part of this, right?
And then I was gonna say just quickly, as Jen was saying, well, rent that was $900 pre-pandemic. Rises 50%, it's now $1,350 a month, which is a pretty reasonable rate to pay here in Providence. But people's incomes did not increase in the same way. So while that rent increased by potentially 30, 40, 50%, incomes either diminished because they lost their job, lost a partner who lost a job, or, there's just no ability to keep up with those ones.
And you all are policymakers as elected officials. I testified on several pieces of legislation this year relating to the fact that there is no limitation on the frequency or amount of rent increases in the state of Rhode Island or in the city of Providence. No ordinance, no statute that provides any stabilizing pressure on that. And when I was testifying on these bills, there were a number of different policy proposals, either to limit rent increases to one time per year, or to limit to inflationary variable, or to an increase of 10% or whatever it might be. And I, in highlighting this issue in testimony, have pointed out there are many solutions for which one can choose, but right now, literally no limitation on the frequency or amount. So that means in a theoretical universe, rent could be raised once a quarter, twice a year, and by any increment. So that's very challenging. If you don't know, on a month-to-month tenancy, you don't have that rate locked in for a year. You don't know whether with adequate notice as required by law, you don't know whether or not that might increase a couple of times in a year.
Councilwoman Peterson.
Yeah, you had said consolidation of ownership, and I just was hoping you could elaborate on that.
Oh, sure. So, there's been a trend over the last several decades, really, but especially since the pandemic started, like a lot of rental properties in the bond market, they've been purchased by large scale, like capital interest hedge funds, right, investment funds, that kind of thing. And when you see a number of properties all being bought up by the same entity, that entity kind of has a disproportionate control over pricing, right?
Right.
In certain areas, certain owners might install a monopoly on rental units. I can't speak specifically to, how many properties are owned by which particular entities in which particular neighborhoods, but I think that's definitely worth looking into. When we look at what kind of pressures are being put, what kind of upward pressures are being put on rent. Right, and again, this is kind of a principle of like our free market system, right? About regulations, about protections against things like monopolies, about controls. You can see upward pressures get out.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, I wanted it on record. I mean, I know
Yeah.
what you were trying to get to, but I wanted a much more transparent, because I think we can all assume who some of those bigger players are in our neighborhoods. So I just wanted it a little bit more verbalized. That's all.
Councilor Roy.
Maybe we should, I just, it's not much of a question, it's just a thought that, and I'm in agreement with everything you both have said in terms of policy prescriptions and all of that. I think, real estate, in my view, is it's a wild west. It's, there's no safeguards, it's a free market. And in my view, I think, as long as housing is associated with profit, folks are gonna continue to get squeezed, and so I think, I'd like to pursue, I don't speak for myself, and I hope my colleagues will have an appetite for some policies that could stabilize rents across the city. One of my concerns has been just yesterday, I was at a neighbor's house and I looked into who's the owner of this of this property that's not being taken care of. And I just keep seeing LLCs. And I would like just to see, when I look into sort of homes further, I would love just to see a normal person's name associated without seeing just an LLC. And so it's so difficult to find out if mom and pop landlords are actually a thing in the city anymore, because of that sort of folks hide behind LLC. But it's a huge problem. you know, there's not, as long as that, you know, folks can hide behind LLCs, we don't know. We don't know, you know, who's behind that, you know, we don't know, you know, if they are the absentee landlord, there's no publicly sort of tracking or just scrutiny that can come from that as long as they you know, they hide behind that. So that's and I think, you know, I'd like to think that there are things that can help with that, like a rental registry and whatnot, but I just wanted to say, you know, Karen, both of you, just say it's refreshing and I'm glad we're having this presentation.
And I'm really pleased that you brought up the issue of record registry, because that is one of the things where there's a little bit of progress to report. Because there was legislation introduced at the request of the Attorney General that will create at the Department of Health a transparent public registry of properties. That the focus of that registry is primarily on lead enforcement and whether or not the properties have properly maintained their lead certificate. But it also includes features like requiring a name, address, and contact for the owner of the property. So, you know, it's been an issue that's been much discussed, and you're right that even for us as the attorneys representing tenants, we often have to do a lot of sleuthing to figure out exactly who owns the property. Because the name that is on the pleading, on the eviction that is filed in the court may not be the real party in interest, right? It may be that it's the LLC and we're really trying to get to the bottom of who's in charge, who's been collecting the rent, is the person who collected the rent an authorized agent of the owner or not? Sometimes issues along those lines come up as well. So that is a step forward. And you know, we were very excited to see that legislation pass. It's going to be like a year and a half before that really takes root and is up and being administered, but it will be a step forward in terms of that kind of transparency.
You make it, Councilman.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
So earlier we spoke about $900 or $1,000 perhaps average apartment that we had there. And I think that was about, what, 5 years ago? Perhaps more or less, 2018, 2019. So that's pre-pandemic. But at that time, I think we could purchase an average home, I'll say in Providence, for around $200,000. So at that price, you could afford to rent it at that rate. But, you know, if you read the paper this morning, the average single family home today, it's $445,000. So anybody that buys a house today, it's like 2 or 3 family and pays over $500,000 for it. There's just no way it's going to be able to rent an apartment at $1,000. So I think that the valuation is playing a major role in this. You know, combined with the house insurance that we have. Speaking of Providence, our population is larger. There's no longer 180, but it's close to 200,000 people. We have a lot of competitors coming from our state that, you know, if I'm not willing to pay the $1,500, somebody from Massachusetts will pay $2,000 for an apartment. And that to them would be considered low market. So that's a major factor. And, you know, don't forget that we have the state valuation every 3 years. And my community, Ward 10, some of the value double. You know, so that everything has reached a level that I don't see it coming down. You know, so the $1,100 or less for a typical 2-bedroom apartment, that's a thing of the past. And that's just, it's going to get fine. So also take into consideration the insurance companies. Most insurance have doubled. Increasing utility, water, sewer, that's gone up. What about taxes? We just had tax increase. The cost of maintenance. A box of nail would cost you $5 4 years ago. Today it's like $15. So it's so much so many factors that are contributing to that. I don't know what we
So actually, thank you, Councilman, because the gap between income and affordability, all the pressures you're pointing to are the same pressures that we're seeing.
Yes.
And it would be my assertion that there are really two macro level policy solutions. You either have to affect the income or you have to affect the rents. This is a mismatch. It's a well-documented mismatch that has developed over years. And so I'm going to use an analogy.
And absolutely, and let me just add, the only thing that has not increased to a certain level is the minimum wage.
Correct.
The income, so it's such a
Something like that.
mismatch.
Correct.
It's hard to catch up.
And so, we as a nation made a decision, about 10 years ago to have, a systematic approach to the subsidized purchase of healthcare. And it was a huge undertaking with much controversy. But policymakers decided that there would always be a gap for some of the lowest income residents to be able to purchase health insurance and access to healthcare. And so as a nation and as a state, we looked at how do you fill the gap if the income is too low and there's going to be a population that will need a subsidy. And so I see Mr. Crane here this evening, great to see you, and who represents the Providence Housing Authority. There's a role here for subsidized housing. And with all of the market forces that have been described, we cannot make our way out of this, in my view, make our way out of this disconnect. Until we have two paths. We can either subsidize income and have guaranteed income levels that will make housing affordable at the market price, or we need to subsidize housing in greater proportion than what we have. You as policymakers know that there are very troublingly long waiting lists for Section 8 and access to publicly subsidized housing. And when you have a gap between the cost of a commodity and what people earn, there are actions that government can take. And we as a nation decided to subsidize access to health insurance. There has been significant building on a successful program of Medicaid, like we have a successful program of public housing. And then there's another piece that gets filled in with subsidies like Section 8 that go into the private market, but where the government is involved in that purchase of that service or good. And as someone who was very involved in a former life with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act in Rhode Island, to me, this parallel is just obvious. You have a disconnect between income and a cost of something that is a fundamental human right. I would assert healthcare and housing are both in that category. I know that's a controversial assertion, but it is.
And education, of course.
Yes, and so, you gotta fill the gap. So there are some members of our community will require a subsidy in order to access affordable, safe housing. And I want to emphasize safe because public housing and subsidized housing has more oversight for conditions and safety, health and safety factors. So public housing authorities actually have some transparency and accountability around health and safety. And then Section 8 comes with certain requirements for inspection and upkeep. So there are protections there that our clients often find themselves on a largely much less accountability for conditions in their rental homes because code enforcement is so overtaxed. They do their best, but in order to keep up with the number of properties in Providence that require immediate attention, it's a huge undertaking. So I think that whether we're going to have programs to guarantee income that makes the purchase of housing safe, healthy housing affordable, or subsidize the housing, there's going to be a gap. We just don't know how much of the population will be in that gap. And in Rhode Island, we've gotten over 95% of all Rhode Islanders affordable access to health insurance. That didn't just happen because magic happened. It happened because we have a very carefully constructed program of subsidies with Medicaid expansion and the creation of a health insurance exchange where people can purchase that below market price with a subsidy. So I think that the parallel is very clear between health and housing, and we know that those two things are seriously intersected because a loss of housing also triggers a loss of health.
And at the risk of stating the obvious, as that gap increases between what people are earning and property values, there's only one group of people who can afford the properties, and that's the corporate entities that we talked about.
Yeah.
That's 15 minutes, right? The larger that gap gets, there's one small portion of the population who controls a lot of the money, and they're able to come in and buy it, whatever the property value is. It's 500, 700, 900, it doesn't matter to them. They'll buy it, they'll jack up the rent, and they have no regard for what happens to the community when that happens, right? So, you know, I didn't want to state the obvious. I'm sure that all went on in your brain, but I just wanted to clarify.
Which goes back to what my colleague was saying, we would like to see the mom and dad to be able to own their home.
And for what it's worth, I think
Not at that price.
I think that dream of having, you know, a mom and pop come in, buy a 3-family, live on a floor rent. I don't think that that's really an attainable dream for most folks working an average job in the city. I don't think folks can realistically afford these houses, afford the down payments, afford the mortgage, afford the insurance, afford the 70% interest rates that they're charging. It's crazy.
So I think we wanted to bring you right up to the present in terms of these trends. If you want to continue, what slide are you on now? Okay.
So the next question.
I know what you want. Yeah, we wanted to have a conversation.
Sorry, let the record show that, Madam Clerk, that, Councilman Miguel Sanchez is here as well. And I would really appreciate if you join us in this conversation at the table, please. Sir.
And basically, the next couple of slides really are just more than the same, showing trends, right? We don't need to like dwell on them for very long, I don't think. We've had a very spirited discussion so far. But you can see that the next line is monthly eviction filings from 2020 to 2023. This just provides a slightly broader picture. I mean, I apologize, squeezing all that data into one page was a little bit tight. But you know, what you're really just looking at is blue versus orange there, and contrast I think helps, where blue is average over time and orange is what was actually happening during those months. So you can see that, you know, during the pandemic, when there were protections in place, moratoria, access to rental assistance for people who are struggling to pay their rent, whether in part or in full. You see that eviction filings are much lower. And then you actually see, again, towards the end of that graph, right where it says, July, September, November, January 2023, you can see that eviction filings go right back up to historic levels, and in many months actually higher than historic levels. And again, that coincides with the first slide where I pointed out, you know, rent relief ended in June of 2022 and paid out for a couple of months thereafter, but that's exactly when we see the filings here. So this is just kind of a broader picture of the same thing. And again, when there's will and ability to implement certain controls on the market and like people's behavior, we see filings do go down, stabilizes people's lives, right? Stabilizes them in their homes. And then the next slide is, again, just it's similar to this presented in a different way. So that dotted line is just the average number of filings per month, and you can see which months were, you know, below and above that line. So again, from January of 2020, which was, you know, before protections were in place, but right when the pandemic started. Through about, again, July of 2022, we have below average evictions, then afterwards, at historic norms. Or
I got
above.
a quick question.
Yes.
Well, that's the eviction. But weren't the courts closed for a period of time? If so, when was that?
See the gap there in May
22.
April and May, no, 20.
2020. So,
2020.
Yeah.
so when the pandemic became fully, when people became fully aware around March, of 2020, there was a period when the courts closed for all purposes, just closed. But actually, contrary to popular perception, most courts began to gradually reopen even during 2020, doing either remote hearings or a limited calendar or having different kinds of social distancing and masking to protect people coming into the courthouse. So, yeah, the total shutdown, when there were little or no, this is filings, not hearings. So there was a period when no cases were being filed, but that was very brief. And then cases were being filed, but perhaps not heard. And there were significant delays in cases during this period. There was also the partial CDC moratorium, which affected filings. So there were a whole bunch of policy solutions swirling around in that period where you see the red line below the dotted line. Those are below average filings because of all the pressures we've talked about that reduced those, but they didn't go away entirely, except you see that one between March and July, there's a no red line. I don't think that means there were in real terms no filings made, but they were, the courts were actually closed and then very slowly and gradually reopened.
I think an important point since we're on the topic of those protections, whether it's the CDC moratoria, CDC declarations that you could fill out, which would prevent evictions from going forward, even if it hadn't been filed. All those protections were designed to forestall evictions for non-payment of rent, right? Under the theory that the pandemic was disrupting people's ability to earn money, that disruption in their income, then it's inability to pay rent. So we needed to kind of slow things down. But all throughout the pandemic, there was nothing that protected month-to-month tenants from the normal eviction process, termination of tenancy, where it wasn't about the rent, but rather a landlord just exercising their right to ask somebody to vacate the unit with at least 30 days notice, compliant with the law. And so a lot of the evictions that we saw filed during that time were actually of that type, the termination of tenancy cases. Those will often happen after a sale of home or when the sex put in the house to commit abuse. One of the ways that tenants can be protected from that type of disruption is by having a lease. Not every tenant, in fact, most tenants I work with don't have a lease for a term. Tenants who have a lease for a term, obviously they don't have a right to stay past that lease, but during that lease, as long as they're abiding by the terms of the lease, fulfilling their obligations, i.e. to pay rent and fees, lease type of would. They're protected from their tenancy being terminated before the term of that lease ends, which provides a certain measure of security. A lot of people initially have a lease when they move to a place that lease expires and they continue as month-to-month tenants. I think we're all probably aware of that process, right? Many guys have lived that experience, myself included. You sign a lease and 10 years later, you're like, wait a minute. Do I have an agreement? Do I have a lease? Where am I?
I have a question on the lease. We just not too long ago passed our policy around sourcing. How do you see that? I mean, I've heard landlords say that they are not no longer renting a full-term lease, but month by month. Are you experiencing that in some of your work that you do in your case, in some of your court cases?
I mean, yeah, I'm aware of landlords who prefer to have month-to-month leases with tenants. And I'm aware of landlords who don't want to have leases at all. And I'm aware of landlords who are perfectly happy to sign leases for a term. It really, I mean,
So
again,
there's not exceeding people who have changed their mind about lease agreement because of that.
I couldn't speak to any specific experience I've had that would
Okay.
demonstrate that, anything more than anecdotally a very small sample. So,
But I would say that the minority of clients who come to us have a lease for a term, and that's not new. Since I came to the center in 2017, and at that time, it was far less than half. Perhaps less than a quarter of our clients on intake, you know, it was one of the first things we asked, do you have a lease? Or are you on a month-to-month tenancy? And the vast majority of our clients who are low-income tenants, and, you know, it represents a cross-section of that group, do not have a written lease for a term. And that leads to all sorts of complications, honestly.
Councilman Lawrence.
I was just gonna ask that question, like, in your sort of, when you're serving your clients and that anecdotally, what you've noticed is, and I think you answered the question, is that it seems like the majority of your clients don't have a lease, that they are month to month, which in my view probably makes them very vulnerable. And I'm on a, I'm a renter and just full transparency, I'm on a month to month. And that scares me, I'd like to think that a lot of residents of the city are on month to month, and I would like to somehow get real data to find out what that number is, because that's, I think, could inform some of what we do here,
Chris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. On that note, are you aware of any local or state legislation to sort of mandate rental leases or any laws that exist?
You know, as we were sitting here unpacking this question, it struck me that I haven't seen legislative proposals to require a term lease. And I will say that there are pros and cons for both parties, like when we advise tenants. There are some reasons why a tenant might not want to be locked in for a year. Just as sometimes a property owner may not wish to be locked in for a year. But generally speaking, if you know you're going to be in the place for a while, it has a protective feature, particularly against increases during the term. That's the most obvious, that you're then not just at the whim of rental increases. And so, it's interesting that I haven't seen legislative proposals to put stricter requirements and limit the method of having a month to month fee. What for us, in our client base, that is the dominant form of tenancy. So I'm not sure that was the case when I first started renting, which was 40 years ago. It was very difficult to have a lease. And I think that may have eroded over the last 4 decades, such that whatever the forces are on both sides of that equation, that has become much less common in low income rentals. I will say that I think that if someone is renting a luxury apartment, they probably have a 12-month lease. And that may speak volumes about whether or not people think that's advisable.
I will say in my experience representing tenants over the last 3 years, a great number of my clients had a lease at one point, that lease expired, and many of them, very many of them, would like to get back on. And they may have asked to do so, and were not offered a lease. There's not a way to compel a landlord to offer somebody a lease like that. And I think that many of the clients I represented would have accepted the offer of the lease had one been made. But again, that wasn't on the table during the course of their relationship with their landlord.
You may continue.
Could go to the next
Can we
slide.
go to the next slide? Yes, sure. So it would be valuable to just look at that on who's actually affected by evictions. And you see the orange bar there, right, is the shared population that has an eviction filed against them. The blue bar underneath is the share of renters in the population, right? So for instance, Black individuals, they comprise 14% of renters, but 15% of evictions. Latinx individuals, 31% of renters, 33% of evictions. White individuals, 49% of renters, 44% of evictions. So we immediately see some disparities along the lines of race. We also in fact see disparities along the lines of gender. People identified as female being evicted at a rate of 56%, as opposed to the price of 53% of the population.
And John, do you want to update that in terms of in our current caseload, what you saw?
Yeah, so I ran some numbers specific to Providence today. So from January 1st, 2023 through the present, what we're seeing, and it's important to remember that this is just Center for Justice numbers. This doesn't include Rhode Island Legal Services or any tenants who may have had the ability to hire private counsel, which is a very, very small amount. So these are just Center for Justice numbers. We have held a total of 377 folks this year. 29% of those folks identify as Black, 31% identify as Hispanic, 4% as multiracial, 2% as Native American, 24% as white, 7% as other, and a small percent as Asian or Pacific Islander. And then also as far as spend some time a little while ago talking about income levels, the average individual who comes through the Center for Justice with an eviction since January 1st of 2023 has been around 106.18% of the poverty guidelines. So pretty much right at what is listed as poverty guidelines. Now these numbers include subsidized housing, private housing, public housing in the state, and it's, I mean, in the city of Providence. So those numbers again are only Center for Justice, only city of Providence. When you add in Rhode Island Legal Services numbers, see those percentages we would expect to stay similar. But the total household size, the number of folks who have experienced an eviction just in 2023 is much greater than the 377 number.
And there's a big gap between what we saw in our caseload and this statewide number from the eviction lab. So I think that it really skews much more heavily to harmfully impacting families of color in the city. And we can do a broader data run. John was just looking at our numbers from January. One of the things that's important to note is that until about, we always collected racial information so that we could try and build that a profile to understand who's being most impacted. But in the court system, there's no reporting of that data. So we knew that there were 8,000 evictions roughly on average in the court system in Rhode Island before the pandemic, but we had no data on how that broke down. So we've been collecting this information, and our colleagues at Rhode Island Legal Services are also collecting that information in part through a project that the city had been supporting for eviction defense. So we've been collecting that data. I think we now will have 2 or 3 years and be able to really draw some meaningful conclusions about the disparate impact of eviction on residents of color in the city.
Madam Chair,
Chris.
quickly, how many households with children do you generally see? Do you have any data on that?
It's not totaled up. If you give me like 2 minutes, I can total it up, but I would say just a quick glance. It's probably upwards of 60 to 70% of this households actually.
We recently submitted a data report. This is the most recent, so John just pulled that today. But, report that we filed at the end of last month, it was well in excess of 50% of all households impacted by eviction, including children under the age of 18. And in many instances, more than one child. So we do collect that, and we'll be happy to share it with the committee after this evening's presentation.
Councilman Sanchez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks so much for this information. Just for my understanding clarity, in terms of workload and cases capacity, are you guys in Rhode Island Legal Services pretty similar, or is one doing way more cases a year than the other?
So I'll answer it this way. Rhode Island Legal Services has 2 or 3 more attorneys than we do, so it's a slightly bigger caseload, but the average number of cases handled is very similar. And we've both been very actively involved in a collaborative looking at the issue of access to legal defense for eviction for about 5 years now. And we're part of a national network looking at the issue of eviction rights council. So there is a movement nationally to think about the issue of whether or not housing is such an important human need that it rises to the level of a right, and whether or not therefore there should be publicly subsidized access to attorneys to defend residents in the case of eviction. So the most prominent case study is New York City. New York City implemented right to counsel for eviction about 7 years ago, I think now, and has made a significant investment in providing basically indigent defense, providing lawyers for tenants who are facing homelessness, who are unable to afford a lawyer. And that has been spreading nationally. There are probably about 17 jurisdictions across the country now who do provide a right to counsel or are moving towards it. So for example, our neighbors in Connecticut have implemented a statewide right to counsel, but because they needed to phase it in, both in terms of frankly staffing up to that.
Right.
So if you turned to us and said, we want you to represent every low income individual who is facing an eviction, we would say, we can't. Even if you were willing to pay us, because that would require significant staffing increases. Because we simply don't have the capacity, even we and Rhode Island Legal Services combined don't have that capacity at this present time. But it is something that we are very serious about and dedicated to trying to expand. In Connecticut, they're phasing in right to counsel by zip code.
Oh, wow.
So they're looking at prioritizing zip codes that are known to have a high proportion of residents below a certain income level. I go to regional conferences with legal aid and legal services directors, and I definitely do not recommend the zip code approach because it's driving them crazy in Connecticut. Because then you're in the awful circumstance of having someone call you and say, I'm facing eviction. I have 3 young children. I have had experienced a loss of income. I've lost my job. I've been in a car accident. And then you have to say, oh, well, what zip code do you live in? And then when they say the wrong number, they lost the lottery. It's kind of very problematic to implement. And I think that lawmakers in Connecticut are realizing, whoa, that was kind of rough. And so that program by design will become universal, but they had to figure out how to ramp it up. And so in New York City, I think the approach was to start with the lowest income and then move up to broader eligibility over time. Because you can't just like turn a program like that on and have it be at scale
Right.
in the first months.
So is it municipalities and state bodies that are taking this?
Mostly municipal, but because of our size, we're very quirky. Like if we did a statewide program, we would be less than the New York City program by a factor of, I don't know, 50. I haven't done the math on that, but in other words, it's mostly larger cities that are taking this on as an issue. But there are several statewide initiatives, including Connecticut, and several other states.
Just my last question.
Councilman,
Thank you. So I mean, in those states, is it like organizations like yourself, or like can they tie it into like the public defender's office of like right to?
I looked at this question all across the country, and in every place where right to counsel or expanded access to eviction defense is being implemented, it's done through expansion of civil legal aid and civil legal services. Because the public defender capacity is already so taxed in most settings that until those entities reach what they need. So for example, there's been a study recently done in Rhode Island that demonstrates that the public defender's office is significantly understaffed and underfunded. And so in no other jurisdiction nationally are those offices being asked to take on a new body of work when they're already not staffed and funded for the work that they're constitutionally assigned. But in all of these other jurisdictions, basically the way it's done in New York City is standard, if you will, which is to make the decision to create the right legislatively, to create a phase-in plan for implementing that, and to dedicate public funds to an RFP type of procurement process where legal aid and legal services providers step up and say, we think we can represent, 20% of those who may face an eviction this year. So in all the other jurisdictions, it's done by an array of legal aid and legal services providers, each of whom step in and commit to taking a portion of the work.
I would ask from here on that we sort of wait with the rest of our questions. So we can get through the presentation. I'm sure that a lot of it be answered through the presentation. We actually have to do a hard cutoff at 25 past. Councilman is taking us into another meeting. Fortunately, if you don't mind, because this is good.
As we go through the rest of, oh, I'm sorry to interrupt.
You're doing a good job. We're learning a lot.
And thank you again for the time. As we go through the rest of the slides, I think you'll find that the questions you've been asking actually address a lot of what's left in this presentation. As we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about, the causes of eviction, many of which we've already covered, right? The inability to pay rent for various reasons. One of which is the rising rent, which we've talked about at length, right? One that we've touched on very briefly, but haven't talked about at length is withholding rent due to substandard conditions. There are a number of people that we run into in our practice who would take it upon themselves to say, I'm not going to pay rent for this house because this house is not working. That is disallowed under the law. It's an obligation to pay rent, or the landlord can take it to court for failure to pay rent and evict you. We often see things come to a head when people make that decision. They're not without legal recourse for the conditions of their apartment. However, it is a very quick way to get yourself into court on a non-payment eviction. Foreclosure is another one. Though thankfully, several years ago, following the crash of 2008, I believe the state did pass some added protections for people who were living in properties that have been foreclosed upon. If the person that they were renting from was the owner who was foreclosed on, and they could establish they had a prior rental agreement with that individual, there are increased protections. Though we do see that foreclosures do lead to evictions, though at a lower rate and much slower process typically. One of those I mentioned earlier is the sale of property. Often enough, a purchase and sale agreement might be in place between an owner and a seller and a buyer rather. The buyer wants to buy the property free or clear of any other interest in property, which would be tenants who are living there. So people who are month-to-month tenants will be subject to receiving a termination of tenancy notice based in part on the sale of that property. And there's as we were talking about earlier, a termination notice sent because the owner decided to do something else with the property, and they only have to give 30 days notice in order for that to happen if they're a month-to-month tenants. There are a number of reasons that landlords do this, many permissible, some impermissible. But there are a number of landlords who decide they want to raise the rent and move in a family member. Or they might want to turn the house when they're into a bedroom for their dogs. I don't know. That would be allowed. You could do that. So these are the various causes of eviction. We've already largely discussed them.
On that last bullet, it's important to note that in order to terminate a tenancy, you don't need a reason to provide. So like it says to raise rent, to move somebody else in, you don't need to state a reason when you terminate somebody's tenancy in Rhode Island, across the whole state. You can just send it, we're terminating the tenancy, you have to give them the proper amount of notice, that's it. It doesn't matter what the reason is, as long as it's not retaliatory. So that's, I think, just important because there are all these causes of eviction. But at the end of the day, there's no, for this one particular type of eviction, termination of tenancy, which represents at least a portion of the evictions that are being filed. There's no reason required stated unless it's a certain type of housing. The majority.
Oh, it's burning. Councilman.
Yes. How is that interpreted in court though, by the judge? Does the tenant get like an additional week or two, understanding that that person's not gonna be able to find an apartment right away? Are they just gonna put them out on the street, or is the judge gonna be somewhat flexible?
Every case is different, right? And the decisions that a judge makes may be they're guided by the facts in the law, right? So it's impossible to say, exactly what a judge is going to do on any given day or a particular set of facts, but as lawyers, we do our best to guess and predict what a judge will do. Judges are bound to follow the law, they're bound to follow the statutes. So if the statute says that a landlord has the right to reclaim possession of the property if they deliver a legally valid notice, and that notice was delivered and delivered in time, and the tenant remains in possession of that property. I know there's a lot of legal but essentially, if the landlord does everything right in order to, to exercise their right to reclaim the property, then a judge is bound by the statute to order the landlord to be allowed to retake that property. Now, there are certain things the tenants can do legally, to help forestall that, but I mean, the judges, the judge has to follow the law, right?
Essentially, a judge would have no legal basis unless there's some other issue involved. So we should that will be.
Yeah,
You want to do
the
the
next,
slide?
the next slide is, eviction's, effect on housing stability, and look, I think there's like one phrase that is on this page that I just want you all to take away, right? You can think about these bullet points, but it's often thought that poverty causes eviction. It's more often the case that eviction causes poverty. Okay. The eviction process is incredibly disruptive. And that disruption cascades through somebody's life. Their ability to get to work. Their ability to maintain benefits, maintain a mailing benefits. Their ability to get their children to school. People's lives are upended by eviction. And that disruption in their lives often has negative economic consequences. When that happens, they're more susceptible to subsequent eviction. And as that cycle progresses, you see that eviction process might be the catalyst to somebody slipping into a cycle of permanent poverty. Right? Some of the other effects to bear in mind are more granular, right? Is that eviction does create a stigma. We have a public court over Long Island. That's all civil filings. Landlords use it to see if somebody's been evicted. If somebody's applying to rent an apartment, a landlord will go and see if they have you been evicted. Or have you been evicted for non payment of rent? Did you leave owing the landlord $20,000? Was there an eviction filing? Your case was dismissed. Different landlords will treat that differently, but it will follow you around, and it has an impact on your ability to find housing in the future. Right?
So choose that to spend the next 5 minutes.
Yep. And that loss of credibility in the rental market will drive people into substandard housing, right? A market where people aren't making those checks, where the rents are lower, where the conditions are. So I think that's enough for that slide.
We just changed chair. She has to go over.
Is it okay?
So proceed, please.
So, the last two slides, I think we can take in tandem, and, Ms. Wood was just talking about that, right to counsel and the impact of legal representation in the eviction process. We see though a pretty marked difference. I think, this slide is discussing, kind of the cities, states where, right to counsel has been explored, not only explored, and I think Ms. Ferrari spoke, at length about that. The next slide, though, actually has some of the outcomes of having an attorney involved representing the tenants in an eviction process. And you see some pretty dramatic differences right away. Many cases, or many more cases to settle, which is to say, as opposed to going to a trial in front of a judge when there's an attorney representing a tenant. That usually means, and then that's usually because the attorney is able to navigate the process, right? Understand the tenant's rights, press the tenant's defenses if they're available, and find a reasonable compromise to the extent that the defenses, provide some leverage to negotiate a settlement. And when that happens, it's usually the case that a tenant's going to get a better outcome than they would if they were proceeding. That difference usually means more time in the house, abatements is matter, etc.
there's a lot of statistical evidence for the proposition that a tenant with an attorney will do better than a tenant without an attorney. It almost feels laughable to tell you that, because if any one of you was served with a legal process and the other party was represented by a lawyer, you would not want to go away for anything that's important in your life. I mean, it's just obvious that you would prefer to have a professional person representing you who knows what your rights are. And that's borne out by all of the evidence nationally, which is why these cities and states are saying in most places where there is not a policy decision made to have right to counsel, above 90% of tenants are going alone. And before we started doing this work in Rhode Island Legal Services was only able to, we had enough capacity to represent people in public housing settings. So in the entire private rental market, there was no systematic defense to tenants in the state of Rhode Island until 2017, not like 2001, I mean 2017, 2017. So actually, more than 95% of tenants were unrepresented. And that has a huge impact. And by the way, more than 95% of landlords always are represented by counsel. Because it's their business, they own the property, they want to have someone who knows what they're doing, assist them. There are some landlords who do it on their own, but it's less than 5%. So that gap between less than 5% of tenants having lawyers and more than 95% of landlords having lawyers has an obvious outcome. And closing that gap is what we are working with our colleagues at Rhode Island Legal Services to do right now.
All right, so is that it for the slide?
The last slide is just a list of policy
We have
recommendations.
2 minutes.
Nah,
And we
you know,
do have a next door public hearing, we do have a bunch of attorneys waiting for us.
no, absolutely, you don't want to keep the attorneys waiting, I'm sure. Fortunately, we've actually discussed a lot of these policy recommendations in the course of our conversation, which is heartening. And you'll see that they're a mix, I mean, particularly they're a mix of subsidy related policies, ideas, and also the market driven policy ideas, right? Combination of supplementing people's income and controls on the market itself, and creating conditions for market pressures to alleviate.
Listen, I thank you so much. Maybe we'll have to come back at some point.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Very informative. Thank you, Councilman. Yes. So, Madam Clerk, please, there is no more further business on the agenda. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion is made. And thank you, Councilman Roy. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.